Welcome back, focused learners. Ready for another explainer? Today we're unpacking a genuinely fascinating and pretty provocative philosophical text by Xue Feng. It's called Using Consciousness to Transform Cause and Effect. And really, this text totally challenges our fundamental understanding of fate, our own personal agency, and those invisible rules that seem to govern our lives. But to really grasp this philosophy on how we can rewrite fate, we've got to start exactly where the author starts. And, fair warning, it's a stark, deeply tragic story. The text opens with a woman, late 20s, holding her 1-year-old daughter. And, tragically, she jumps from a building to her death.
So, what was the reason for this terrible event? Well, the text tells us she had just returned home to find her husband in bed with another woman. The author then pivots and asks us this really direct, uncompromising question. Was this suicide? No, the text claims. It was homicide. But then, who killed her? Was it the cheating husband, or was it the other woman? Okay, let's dive into this because according to the text, the answer is neither. What actually killed her was the rigid, invisible weight of traditional thinking. The author argues that if she had just possessed a completely different consciousness, if she had simply thought to herself, well, at worst, I'll divorce him and find someone way better, or even if she'd adopted a mindset of equal retaliation, this tragic result would have been entirely avoided. It was that mental constraint, the heavy societal expectation of what his betrayal supposedly meant, that ultimately led to her death.
All right, moving right along to Section 1, Rewiring Cause and Effect, the Mechanics of Fate.
So the core theory presented here is that cause and effect are basically inevitable outcomes of our mindset. That is, unless we actively choose to transform our consciousness. As the text puts it, without transforming consciousness, cause and effect inevitably occur. By changing consciousness, however, cause and effect can be altered. The author explains that humanity is essentially living under this huge, heavy influence of thought patterns passed down by the people who came before us. And to move from a reality where our lives are just, a series of inevitable reactions into a realm of true freedom, we have to break those inherited mental chains. The text even suggests that if you can't escape these constraints, you can never attain enlightenment or Buddhahood. You're just stuck repeating the past.
And this brilliantly illustrates the point with a really simple analogy. Think about it like this. If your consciousness is firmly, absolutely set on traveling to New York, you're inevitably going to find yourself on a path to New York. Sooner or later, you're going to arrive there. New York is your inevitable effect. But if halfway there, you completely change your mind and decide, actually, my destination is London, well, every single aspect of your journey instantly changes. That inevitable arrival in New York, it simply isn't going to happen anymore. By changing the consciousness, the entire trajectory of reality gets rewritten.
Which brings us to Section 2, Breaking Traditional Mental Chains, Shattering Societal Dogma. To see how this framework actually applies to real-world societal pressures, let's look at the author's first example. For thousands of years, there's been this dominant, traditional thought pattern of all unfilial acts having no descendants is the greatest. The text argues that this one specific idea essentially forces people into marriage and parenthood, and it buries anyone without children under immense guilt, discrimination, and just general earthly suffering. But how do you go about rewiring this? Well, the author suggests a major shift in consciousness. Imagine thinking instead, the human world is a sea of suffering. Having children just drags them into this suffering. So instead of stressing over earthly descendants, this transformed mindset focuses on self-cultivation. The goal becomes reaching a higher spiritual plane, which the text calls the 1,000-year world, to have children in the heavenly kingdom where they'll truly be blessed. That mental shift completely shatters the earthly chain of guilt. Let's look at a second example. This one examines the traditional saying of all evil deeds, sexual indulgence is the worst. The text explains that the word indulgence originally just meant, excess. Simple as that. But over time, society rigidly narrowed that definition down to mean basically any sexual behavior outside of marriage, branding it as the ultimate sin. According to the author, this redefinition effectively erases one of life's most beautiful experiences. It forces people into secrecy, self-repression, and deep mental torment, which the text argues leads to countless human tragedies. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the text proposes countering that dogma with a totally alternative mindset. It says, romantic love is a precious gift from the greatest creator. Life is fleeting, flowers wither, and youth fades. As long as it brings joy without disturbing others or society, why should we repress or torment ourselves? The author makes the case that enjoying romance actually aligns perfectly with natural law. By adopting this new consciousness, you break the whole restriction of it being the worst of sins. You drastically expand your life's freedom, and you completely transform the cause and effect that would have otherwise guaranteed you a life of repression.
Moving on to Section 3, the spiritual destination, the Life Shan Yuan trajectory.
So if we're dropping all these traditional earthly guilts, where is this newly transformed consciousness actually supposed to lead us? The text outlines some very specific Life Shan Yuan values that serve as the new coordinates for your consciousness. They include walking in the way of the greatest creator, making your life's actual purpose the pursuit of joy, happiness, freedom, and fulfillment, and striving for much higher realms of existence, specifically things like the 1,000-year world, the 10,000-year world, or the Celestial Islands continent. The author notes that establishing this specific consciousness is literally like pursuing the sun to escape the darkness. Your entire view on life and existence transforms, and the sufferings that were supposedly destined to hit you, they simply never come to fruition.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 4, Ascending the Mind, 8 Levels of Thinking.
The essence of transforming your consciousness requires actually upgrading how you think. To move from a chaotic mind to a state of total clarity, the author outlines 8 ascending levels of thinking. They start at material thinking, then climb up to imaginal, associative, illusionary, visualized, up into Tai Chi thinking, formless thinking, and finally holographic thinking. The text makes it clear that each of these steps is significantly more powerful than the last. They hold greater and greater transformative potential the further up that ladder of the mind you climb.
I actually want to pause here for a second and do a quick deep dive on one of those highest levels, formless thinking. According to the text, when someone hits this level, they've achieved a state of true enlightenment. Formless thinking is entirely devoid of self-form and all external forms. In this state, even concepts of dharma, universal truths or laws, and non-dharma, they just simply don't exist anymore. According to the text, reaching this state is the absolute ultimate key to escaping the constraints of human thought entirely and entering a totally liberated, expansive state of existence.
Which sets us up perfectly for Section 5, Switching Off the Power, Severing Cause and Effect. And this brings us to a really radical conclusion in the philosophy. Once a person reaches this formless state we just talked about, can this shift actually erase the consequences of earthly actions? Things like corruption or even eating meat? Well, the text's reasoning goes like this. Because formless thinking completely lacks all forms, the very concepts of corruption or eating meat fundamentally cease to exist within that consciousness. Since the forms themselves don't exist to an enlightened mind, there can be no resulting cause and effect. The karma is effectively neutralized, simply because the action isn't even recognized by the formless consciousness. So the crucial point is captured beautifully in the author's final metaphor. Imagine a main power supply in a house. When your consciousness is bound by earthly rules, that power is flipped on, meaning every cause has a direct, unavoidable effect. But formless thinking, it pulls the plug. It switches off the main power supply. Because the root of all cause and effect is consciousness itself. When the root cause within the consciousness disappears, the effects instantly lose all their power. Just like your kitchen appliance is dying when you pull the main breaker, earthly consequences entirely lose their grip on you.
Sui Feng actually concludes the text with this lingering, super provocative thought. I cannot elaborate further, as it would reveal too much. The rest must be realized through personal insight. It is such a fascinating endpoint, right? It leaves us questioning the very nature of our reality, the true limits of our personal agency, and those invisible chains we might just be accepting as inevitable. Are you headed for New York, or are you ready to change your destination? The rest, as the text says, is entirely up to your own personal insight. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.